I was standing knee-deep in the water, the sunset casting a beautiful glow over the hills of my own ranch, when a guy in a beige vest and a smug grin swaggered up to the bank, holding a clipboard. His voice boomed across the lake. "You're in violation of the HOA fishing regulations. That'll be a $1,500 fine." I was completely taken aback. "I'm on my own property." "Doesn't matter," he smirked, scribbling away. "The HOA governs this lake. You didn't register your fishing activity. It's in the community guidelines." That's when I lost it. I didn't yell, I didn't argue. I just smiled, because I knew something he didn't. I'd already been talking to the county about this lake's water rights. And what this guy, and the entire neighborhood for that matter, didn't know was that the land underneath the lake wasn't owned by the HOA. It belonged to a private trust. And that trust was looking to sell. So, I did what any reasonable rancher who just got fined for fishing on his own land would do. I bought the entire lake. Every single acre. And the next day, a big wooden sign went up at the entrance: "Private lake, no fishing, no trespassing, neighborhood access revoked." The HOA board went ballistic. But that was just the beginning of the chaos, because later that evening, someone tried to break into my property with bolt cutters. Let's rewind a bit. Let me tell you how we got to the point where I was being fined for fishing in my own backyard. 3 years ago, I bought a quiet piece of land just outside of town. It was about 50 acres, rolling fields, a small cabin, a pond that swelled into a beautiful lake during the rainy season. Peaceful, isolated, everything I ever wanted after retiring from 20 years in the military. I never cared about neighborhoods or fancy amenities. I wanted land, quiet, and space for my dogs. When I found this property at an auction, I jumped on it. The documents were clear, it was outside the HOA boundary, and the lake bordered the edge of my land. Life was simple for the first year. I raised chickens, grew my vegetables, and fished whenever I felt like it. Occasionally, I'd see some families from the nearby neighborhood stroll over to the edge of the lake. I didn't mind. I was raised to be kind. Let them enjoy the view, I thought. One kid even came over one day and asked to fish. Sure, I smiled. Just don't leave trash behind. But slowly, things changed. What began as a few walkers turned into full-on family picnics, blankets, umbrellas, even grills. One Saturday, I found 2 guys unloading jet skis onto the water like it was their own personal resort. That's when I politely walked over and told them this wasn't a public facility. The man snorted. "We're HOA members. This is our lake. We have community rights." I blinked. "Sir, I live on this land. This lake is partially on my ranch." "Well, the HOA owns the rest. That means you follow our lake use rules." I didn't argue. I simply called the county office to verify ownership again. And yes, they confirmed, only the water body surface rights were shared. But the land underneath the lake was owned by a private trust, not the HOA. Not me either. Yet. A month later, I got the first letter. It was from the HOA, stating that all individuals using the lake must now register their activities and that I was in violation for not submitting a lake use schedule for my property. I laughed, tossed the letter in the trash, and went back to building my chicken coop. But then, a week later, I received a fine in the mail, $500. The letter said I was caught unauthorized fishing on a regulated body of water. I marched straight to the HOA office at the edge of the neighborhood. Inside, a blonde woman in her late 50s sat behind a huge desk that seemed way too grand for her title, HOA president. Her nameplate read Deborah Thompson, and she wore a name tag like she was a general. "I'm not part of your HOA, I told her calmly. She looked up from her laptop with a tight smile. "If you use the lake, you follow the rules. We've always managed the lake for community use." I leaned in. "Then maybe I'll manage it myself." Her smile faded. "Excuse me?" I turned and walked out. I wasn't bluffing. I called the trust again. Turns out, they were actively trying to sell. We scheduled a meeting for the next week. But before that could happen, I got another visit. This time from an HOA security team, which was just 3 guys in bright yellow polos with radios and clipboards. They showed up at my ranch gate. "You need to remove your dock. It's not compliant," one of them said. "It's a wooden platform," I replied. "I built it for myself on my land. Doesn't matter. If it's on the lake, it's a violation." That night, someone cut the rope to my dock. It didn't sink, but it drifted out 30 feet and got stuck in some reeds. My dogs barked like crazy at 2 a.m., and when I came out with a flashlight, I saw muddy footprints by the shoreline. That's when I decided it was time to end this mess. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. The next week, I finalized the purchase of the lake bed. It wasn't cheap, but I had the savings. I wasn't just buying peace, I was buying back my dignity. And that led to the sign, the one I put up that Monday morning: "Private Lake, Access Tear. Nated HOA trespassers will be prosecuted." The next day, I installed trail cameras and floodlights all around the lake's edge. I wasn't playing games anymore, which brings us back to that first evening. After the sign went up, someone snuck onto my ranch with bolt cutters. They were trying to open my side gate near the lake. I caught them on camera, but the video cut off when they pointed a flashlight at it. What they didn't know was that the camera had night vision. I turned the footage over to the sheriff. But what happened next, no one saw coming, because the HOA didn't back off. They filed a lawsuit against me. Yes, a full-blown lawsuit. And it wasn't just petty fines anymore. They claimed I was the one trespassing on the lake I now legally owned. The envelope arrived 2 days later, stamped in bold red, "Official notice, legal action pending." I sat on my front porch, coffee in hand, and opened it slowly. My dogs, Duke and Bailey, lay at my feet, unaware that their peaceful world was being challenged by a board of suburban warriors armed with clipboards and bad intentions. The HOA was suing me for interference with community recreation and malicious obstruction of neighborhood enjoyment. They even claimed emotional distress for blocking access to the lake, which they said was critical to neighborhood morale. I stared at the paper and laughed out loud. You'd think I poisoned their gardens or demolished their homes. Nope. I just fished on my land, then bought the lake. I immediately called my friend Corey, a retired JAG officer who now ran a small legal consulting firm nearby. "They're trying to scare you," he said after reviewing the paperwork. "You bought the lake bed fair and square. Surface water use is not ownership. If the trust sold it to you, that lake is private now. They have no claim." "But they think they do," I replied, pacing. "And they're loud." He chuckled. "Let them shout. I'll draft a response." A few days later, Corey filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit. At the same time, we delivered a counter notice: if any HOA member stepped onto my land again, they'd be the ones facing charges. I thought that would calm things down. It didn't. Instead, they got bolder. The HOA started printing flyers, yes, actual paper flyers, and stuffing them in mailboxes around the neighborhood. The headline: "Selfish Rancher Destroys Lake Fun for Everyone. Tell him to stop." One of the neighbors, probably a teenager, slipped one under my gate with a handwritten note: "Why are you so mean? We just want to fish." That one stung a bit. I loved kids. I wasn't trying to ruin anything, I just wanted to be left alone on my land. But the HOA had twisted the story, turning me into the villain. And then came the sabotage. That weekend, I woke up to find my new private lake sign missing. In its place was another one that read, "Community Lake, all welcome, let's take Haiti back." I was furious. I checked my cameras again, and sure enough, there was footage of a woman in a tracksuit sneaking onto the property just before dawn with a screwdriver and zip ties. Deborah Thompson, HOA president, caught red-handed. I emailed the footage directly to the sheriff and filed a police report. 2 days later, a deputy knocked on my door. "Mr. Hawkins," he said, tipping his hat. "We saw the video. She'll be cited for trespassing. "Do you want to press charges?" I paused. It would have been easy to say yes, but something in me hesitated. "Just let her know I've got more cameras," I said. "And next time, there won't be warnings." The deputy nodded. "Understood. But between us, this ain't over. She's persistent." Boy, was he right, because the next extreme hit harder than anything I expected. The HOA board called an emergency town hall right there at the neighborhood clubhouse, and instead of cooling things down, they whipped the whole place into a frenzy. I wasn't invited, but Corey was. His cousin lived in the neighborhood and slipped us a recording. Deborah stood at the podium, voice tight with fury. "We must regain access to the lake. He stole it from us. It's not just about water, it's about principle. We are the heart of this community. If he doesn't cooperate, we escalate." Someone in the crowd shouted, "Let's build a path through the back fence." Another yelled, "We'll fish at night." Deborah raised her hand. "No, this is war, and I've already taken the first step." The crowd went silent. She smiled. "I've hired a private investigator. Let's see if Mr. Hawkins is really as innocent as he claims." And just like that, the HOA had gone nuclear. I didn't even know yet that a man in a black SUV was already parked half a mile from my ranch, watching my every move with a long-lens camera. But I found out soon enough, because later that night, my dogs went wild, barking at the tree line. And when I came out with a flashlight, I saw the glint of a camera lens in the bushes. I stood frozen on my porch, the beam from my flashlight locked onto the reflective glint in the bushes. It moved slightly, confirming it wasn't my imagination. "Duke, stay," I whispered, tightening my grip on the flashlight. Bailey was already growling low and deep in her chest. On slowly from the porch. Crunch. Crunch. The dry grass under my boots sounded like firecrackers in the silence of the night. "Who's out there?" I shouted, aiming the light toward the brush. No answer. Then I saw the silhouette, a man crouching, camera in hand, dressed in dark clothes. He didn't move until I took another step forward. That's when he bolted. He darted through the trees. But what he didn't know was that the west end of my property ended in a narrow creek bed, deep, muddy, and steep. I whistled sharply, a signal my dogs knew well. Duke ran left, Bailey right, flanking the stranger with military precision. Seconds later, I heard the satisfying splat of someone slipping and landing face first in the mud. By the time I got there, he was sitting up, soaked and cursing under his breath. "You're trespassing," I said calmly. "Want to explain what you're doing?" He looked at me, embarrassed and clearly shaken. "Just doing my job, man." "Who sent you?" He sighed. "Deborah Thompson, HOA president. She paid me to take pictures. Said you were dangerous, hiding something. She wanted dirt. Something to make you give up the lake." I pulled out my phone and hit record. "Say that again." He didn't argue. I had all the proof I needed now. HOA Karen had crossed the line from petty to criminal harassment. The next morning, I took the recording and video footage to the sheriff. This time, I wasn't as forgiving. "She paid someone to stalk me on private property," I told the officer. "That's not just trespassing, that's criminal harassment." He agreed. The man with the camera was fined and given a court date. Deborah was slapped with a restraining order, effective immediately. She was no longer allowed to come within 100 feet of my property. I felt victorious for about 48 hours. Then the real war began. HOA members started organizing what they called lake protests. They'd line up along the neighborhood side of the lake with signs that read, "Open our lake. Stop the greed. Lake lives matter." One woman stood in a kayak, yes, a kayak, just 5 feet from my shoreline, yelling through a megaphone, "You don't own the water." I walked down to the edge with a hot cup of coffee and a lawn chair. I didn't say a word, just sat, sipped, and watched the circus unfold. That's when Deborah returned. Despite the restraining order, she stood in full view at the protest. She didn't cross the line, but she made her presence known. She had on a t-shirt that said, "I fight for the people." What people, I didn't know. Corey called me that night. They've now launched a petition in the neighborhood to force the HOA board to sue you again, but this time in civil court, to challenge the land sale. I raised an eyebrow. Can they even do that? Corey sighed. Not really, but it'll cost you time and legal fees just to fight it. It was then I realized this wasn't about the lake anymore. It was about control. Deborah and her army weren't just upset I bought the lake. They were furious that I had outsmarted them. I was the outsider, the rogue rancher, and I had taken something they believed was theirs simply because they had used it freely for years. So, I decided it was time to hit back harder. If they wanted to fight dirty, I'd fight smart. I installed a full chain-link fence along the border where their neighborhood met the lake. I even added security motion sensors and solar floodlights that triggered the second anyone crossed the line. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. And I took it a step further. I contacted the local wildlife department and partnered with them to designate my side of the lake as a protected habitat zone. With the right paperwork and donations, we turned it into a registered conservation area, closed off from human activity. That made it federally protected. Even if they tried to sue again, they'd now be going against both a private landowner and a wildlife preservation law. The local news caught wind of it and ran a small feature, "Retired Veteran Turns Lake into Wildlife Refuge After HOA War." Public opinion started turning in my favor. But that's when the next extreme event happened, and it shook everything. One night, I was out fixing a broken fence post by the lake when I smelled something strange. Burning wood. I turned and saw it. Flames. My wooden dock was on fire. Someone had set it ablaze. I dropped the hammer I was holding and ran. The crackling flames leapt high into the sky, painting the dark lake surface with streaks of orange and red. My dock, hand-built, weathered with years of memories, was ablaze, glowing like a torch in the night. Bailey barked wildly behind me, while Duke sprinted ahead toward the shoreline. "Call 911. I yelled over my shoulder, fumbling with my phone as I ran. By the time the fire department arrived, it was too late. The dock was reduced to smoldering black timbers floating near the bank, smoke curling up into the night sky. The fire chief, a gruff, no-nonsense guy I'd met once at a town fundraiser, gave me a look. "You've made enemies," he said flatly. "No kidding," I muttered. We both stared at the charred remains. "They used gasoline," he added. "There are traces on the ground." I didn't need to guess who did it, but unlike the break-ins and protests, this was arson. This was federal. This was jail time serious. And I had cameras again. I pulled up the footage on my phone and scrolled until I found it. A dark SUV pulling up near the trailhead that fed from the neighborhood onto my land. 2 figures, both wearing hoodies, sneaking through the trees, stopping near the dock. One holding a red container. And just before the flames went up, the camera caught a glimpse of the back of one hoodie, printed in bold white letters, "Lake Access Now." I turned the footage over to the sheriff the next morning. He didn't even hesitate. "We've got enough to press charges," he said. "And by the way, that woman, Deborah? Her son drives that SUV." I blinked. "You're kidding." "Dead serious. We're picking him up now." It felt like a small win, but I knew better. This was only going to stir the pot. Sure enough, by the end of the day, a new social media post from the HOA went viral across town. Local rancher accuses teen of arson. This is what happens when you challenge the system. The comments were worse. "Old man trying to ruin kids' futures. Why not just share the lake? He's weaponizing the law." One post even said, "Let's teach him a lesson. We'll take back the lake." I started receiving anonymous texts, "Watch your back. You ain't safe out there alone." I held the rezoning notice in my hand, jaw clenched. I had seen a lot during my 20 years in the military. Ambushes, politics, betrayals. But I never thought I'd have to battle a suburban HOA using local government as their weapon. The hearing was in 2 weeks. That gave Deborah just enough time to rally her troops and twist the story even more. She wasn't just fighting for the lake anymore. She was on a mission to paint me as the grumpy, greedy old man who hated kids, nature, and happiness. The flyers came first. Bright green, stuck under car windshields all over town. Come to the zoning hearing. Stop a rich landowner from blocking access to our children's lake. Don't let one man rob a whole community. They even listed the hearing date, time, and location in bold, with a smiling photo of Deborah standing near the lake as if it were already hers again. Next came the social media campaign. Dozens of HOA members started sharing memories of lake days from years ago. Some were real, most were exaggerated. One claimed that her grandfather had proposed to her grandmother on the lake shore 50 years ago. Problem was, the lake had only existed in its current form for 22 years after the reservoir expansion. But facts didn't matter anymore. They were building a narrative. And I knew I had to fight back, but not with anger, with truth. So, I decided to go public too. I asked Corey to help me create a website, MaLakeMeLand.com. It told the real story, how I bought the land illegally, how I welcomed the neighborhood for years until I was harassed, fined, and even stalked. I uploaded the video of Deborah's son setting fire to my dock. I uploaded photos of the burned wood, the restraining orders, the protest signs, even the lake deed showing my name on it. The site went viral. The local news picked it up again. Retired veteran accused of greed fights back with evidence. HOA firebombed his dock. For the first time, people started turning against Deborah. Even some of the neighbors who once held signs began to question everything. A few anonymously emailed me, thanking me for standing up and offering to speak at the hearing. But Deborah wasn't done. The day before the hearing, I woke up to find the entire eastern fence bordering the lake gone. Cut down, posts yanked out. The chain link rolled into a heap. I stared at it, stunned. Whoever did it had brought power tools. It wasn't a prank. This was a coordinated act of destruction. I checked the security camera footage and once again found the proof. But what made my blood run cold was who was leading the group in the video, Deborah herself. No disguise this time, just her, a few neighborhood men, and 2 teenage boys with bolt cutters and a portable saw. They dismantled my fence and laughed while doing it. I showed the footage to the sheriff. He didn't even blink. This is criminal destruction of property and violating the restraining order. That's jail time. Deborah was arrested later that afternoon, hauled out of the clubhouse in handcuffs as HOA members watched in silence. The story made evening news, but even that wasn't enough to stop the hearing. The next morning, the community packed into the county hall. Deborah's seat on the board sat empty. Her attorney stood in her place, insisting that the will of the people must be respected and that the lake should be rezoned for public use to preserve heritage. I sat quietly with Corey and Maria beside me, hands folded. Then it was my turn to speak. I stepped up to the microphone, looked out at the crowded room, and took a deep breath. My name is Daniel Hawkins, I said. I served 20 years in the military. When I retired, I bought a piece of land to find peace, raise animals, and live a quiet life. I welcomed neighbors to fish, to walk. I never charged a penny. But then I was fined, threatened. My dock was set on fire. I was stalked, harassed, and all because I wouldn't give up something I legally own. I held up a photo of the burned dock, then another of the fence that had been cut down. I didn't start this war, but I will finish it. I'm not trying to keep people from enjoying nature. I'm trying to protect my home. The room was silent. Then Maria stepped up. She spoke softly but powerfully. We were manipulated. Many of us didn't know what Deborah was really doing. Some of us were scared to speak up, but this man didn't deserve what we did to him. She turned to me, voice shaking slightly. Mr. Hawkins, on behalf of the quiet neighbors, I'm sorry. There was a long pause. Then the zoning board voted. Unanimous decision, petition denied. The lake remained private. There were gasps. A few people stood up and left, but most remained seated in stunned silence. For you, a free lake is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, Can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. Outside the courthouse, I exhaled for the first time in days. But just as I was walking to my truck, Corey's phone buzzed. He looked down and said, "Dan, you're not going to like this." I turned to him, heart sinking. "What now?" He showed me his phone. A new post just uploaded, breaking, HOA declares lake war not over. Emergency vote scheduled to buy back property by force. They weren't done. They were planning to take my lake by any means necessary. The moment I read that post, something changed in me. I had tried to play fair. I had tried to be civil. I had tried to be kind. But this wasn't a disagreement anymore. It was a hostile takeover. The HOA wasn't just after my lake. They wanted to humiliate me, break me down, and show every neighbor what happened when you dared to say no to them. But what they didn't know was that I still had 1 card left to play, and I was about to lay it on the table. The very next morning, I marched down to the county registrar's office with Corey and filed a new deed. Not just reaffirming my ownership of the lake bed, but extending my property lines by 10 feet along the entire shoreline. How? Because Deborah had made a critical mistake during her chaos-filled campaign to take the lake. She'd violated multiple property lines with fences, structures, and even community maintenance that technically wasn't authorized by her own HOA charter. Her shared walkway at the back of the lake had spilled onto unclaimed land for years, land that belonged to the same trust from which I had purchased the lake bed. That land had never been properly zoned. It was just sitting there, a thin ribbon of forgotten shoreline. So I bought it. Quietly, legally, fully. That purchase legally cut the neighborhood's entire lake access point off from the water. I now owned the full perimeter of the lake. And once the paperwork was sealed, I did one final thing. I built a solid stone wall, 6 feet tall, topped with private property signs and thorny bougainvillea, circling the entire lake like a fortress. No more gaps, no more access. The lake was mine, and untouchable. 2 days later, the emergency HOA meeting was held. From what Maria told me, it was pure chaos. People screamed, demanded refunds for their HOA dues, asked where all the legal fees had gone, and wanted to know why Deborah had wasted tens of thousands on a war she couldn't win. And then came the final blow. Deborah was removed as HOA president in a landslide vote. Her home was put up for sale a week later. Rumor had it she left town quietly with her son, facing court-ordered community service for the arson. I didn't celebrate. I didn't throw a party or make a speech. I just stood by my new wall one morning, coffee in hand, watching the mist rise from the lake as ducks glided across the calm water. It was quiet again, just like it used to be. But something strange happened a few weeks later. One morning, I found a small box left just outside the gate. No name, no note, just a carefully tied ribbon. Inside was a photo. It was old, slightly faded, but showed 3 kids fishing at the edge of the lake, their feet dangling off a wooden dock. Written on the back in neat handwriting were the words, "Thank you for giving us peace while it lasted. We understand now." A neighbor. That one hit me right in the gut. Because as much as I had fought to protect my land, my freedom, and my dignity, I never wanted to become a symbol of division. So, I made one last move. I called Maria and asked her to help me reach out to some of the quieter families, ones who had respected my land and stayed out of the madness. Together, we created a small program, invite only, for single parents, veterans, and kids who didn't have access to outdoor spaces. A handful of families were allowed to fish and camp under strict rules, with signed waivers and supervised visits. No HOA involved, no politics, just people. The kind of people who understood that kindness isn't weakness. That standing your ground doesn't mean shutting the world out. And that sometimes, a fight worth having isn't about winning, it's about protecting peace. But in the end, I gave it back to the only people who ever deserved it. Not the powerful, but the peaceful. And the lake? It's never been quieter or more alive, just the way I wanted it. That same summer, on a quiet Saturday morning, I sat on the rebuilt dock, this time made of stone and reinforced steel, watching a young boy cast his line into the shimmering water. His mother, a veteran widow named Teresa, stood nearby under a tree, smiling with her arms folded, her eyes scanning the calm surface of the lake like it held every answer she needed. This was what it was all about. Not war, not power, not revenge, but restoration. The community had been shaken, torn in two, but something new was growing, something better, a small circle of trust built not on HOA rules or fine print, but on respect. Word spread slowly through town. A few of the more aggressive HOA members left the neighborhood entirely. Others stayed, quieter now, more reflective. The new HOA board never mentioned the lake again. They had their hands full dealing with internal audits, disgruntled residents, and lawsuits over Deborah's misuse of funds. As for Deborah, she never came back. Some say she moved 2 states over and started working in a real estate office. Others say she lives alone now, refusing to talk about the lake ever again. I never saw her after that, and I didn't need to. The lake wasn't about her. It never was. It was about the quiet man who just wanted to cast a line in peace. About the children who came barefoot to skip stones. About a woman healing from loss, watching her son learn patience as he waited for a fish to bite. About freedom. Every so often, I still get asked why I fought so hard, why I went to court, why I built a wall, why I poured my savings into a lake when I could have just moved away and avoided the mess. But to me, the answer is simple, because some things are worth fighting for. And peace, real peace, only survives when people protect it. So now, every morning, I walk the trail around the lake. Bailey and Duke trot alongside me. The bougainvillea has started to bloom across the wall, deep red and pink. The sun rises, the water ripbles, and sometimes I hear laughter from across the lake. Kids catching fish, parents clapping, a dog barking with excitement. And I know I didn't just win a battle. I built something that will outlast all the noise. A legacy of quiet strength. And a lake that finally, truly belongs to peace.